There is no more compelling evidence of extraterrestrial life having come to Earth and altered our history than the movie Playtime. Yes, I've heard about the pyramids, but I think this movie is a more wondrous achievement. Playtime is simply not like other movies. Well, Tati himself made 5 other movies, but other than those, this movie is unprecedented and never repeated. It wasn't part of the new wave, and it wasn't part, really, of any other movement. Arguably, no movie has pushed the boundaries of what a film can be quite as much as Playtime. Okay, there are a lot of other weird movies out there, some far weirder than Playtime, in fact, but Playtime also has the distinction of being one of the most charming, ingenious, and beguiling movies ever made. It is truly the pinnacle of a genre of one. I've been hyping up this movie a lot, but the truth is that you might actually fall asleep while watching it. This movie has basically no plot, very few traditional dramatic hooks. There's some dialogue, but it's in the background, although the sound mixing in this movie is great. The sound effects, another level, really cool. Anyway, what is Playtime? What is this movie? Well, it's Playtime. It's a game. It's a movie that will set up its own vaudevillian dramatic space and pull you into it. More concretely, I guess, it's a slapstick satire of modernity. It's a comedy, and it's mainly defined by a lot of really elaborate jokes. There's an astounding variety of prestidigitation in this film. I'll give you a bunch of examples shortly, but one thing that unites a lot of the bits in this movie is interactivity. I think this might be the most interactive movie I've ever seen. I'm not talking about any sort of breakthrough technology. This is still technically a one-way channel, the medium, but this movie really manipulates your expectations. To some degree, all comedy films do this. I mean, a lot of movies play on your expectations, but this is on another level. For example, the film opens up in a sleek, modern building. It's some kind of lobby. There's a couple sitting on the chairs. Some uniformed women pass through. Some uniformed men come through. Later, not really clear who they are. We linger in this space for longer than normal, and you start to wonder, what's going on here? Where are we? Right? Well, the game has already begun. You sort of try to puzzle your way through this space, but soon Tati is going to reveal that it is, of course, an airport, the ultimate liminal space. Soon, we're going to be introduced to a whole bunch of characters, some of which will recur again and again throughout the film. This movie mainly follows Monsieur Hulot, a legendary character depicted by Tati himself. But before we meet him, we bump into a fake Hulot. In fact, one of the people in the airport sees a man with the legendary hat, trench coat, and umbrella, the costume, and he says, "Ah, it's you, Hulot." And the stranger turns around and says, "It's not me." This is not the last time the audience will be misdirected with a fake Hulot, and certainly not the last time that the audience will be misdirected in general. There's an interesting mechanism in this film where the characters in the movie often demonstrate or mimic the viewership experience of the audience, like this guy being fooled by the fake Hulot. Well, if you came to this movie as a big fan of Jacques Tati and Monsieur Hulot, you probably would have been fooled right alongside of him. Another example, we soon learn that Hulot has an appointment to make, someone to meet up with, and he makes his way inside another sleek, modern building. Again, we have a situation where we don't quite know what something is when the doorman at the building consults this huge control panel by the door. It turns out to be an oddly designed intercom. The doorman asks Hulot to wait. He sits for a second, and then we hear footsteps from the end of a long hallway, and Hulot starts to stand, and the doorman says, "Well, no, just wait. And we see the guy coming down the hallway, long hallway. We see him walking from the distance, and you think, wait a second, are we just going to wait and watch this guy walk the entire length of this hallway? And Hulot tries to get up again, and the doorman says, no, just wait. Again, it's kind of an interactive moment that plays on your experience of the film, you getting a bit bored. And again, there's some characters on the screen that are having a similar experience to you. Hulot anticipating, getting up, thinking that something is going to happen, but being told to wait. Most movies play on your expectations to some degree, but they tend to be mainly concerned with a story, right? With some kind of plot. Here, it's kind of the opposite. The defining thing of this movie is probably the way it interacts with the viewer. The plot, it takes a back seat. More than other movies, what Playtime really reminds me of is like a magic show or a juggling show, right? I think part of the fun of the movie is seeing just how it's going to work as well. Once you start to realize that there isn't really a story, once you start to grasp the logic of the movie, then there's another layer of expectation as you start to think about what Tati is going to do next, how he's possibly going to conjure another, sort of storyline, other hooks out of thin air. Anyway, there are a lot of different jokes in this movie. I don't really feel any need to classify the different jokes. I think that's kind of a losing battle, and the frog dies. But let me give you a few examples of the variety. There's a scene where Ulo is looking for this guy he's supposed to meet, and he opens up a door inside one of these buildings, and he walks into a board meeting where everybody looks up. That's a simple joke, right? This movie is in many ways a satire of modernity as well, right? A lot of the jokes are angling that way. For instance, we see some great travel posters for global destinations like Hawaii and Mexico, and every single poster features the same sleek, modern building in the foreground with some token local features beside it. Okay, that's a little bit more involved. There is a scene where a salesman is explaining an electric broom to a group of tourists. You might expect an electric broom to be a vacuum, but actually it's a broom with headlights, battery-powered headlights. The salesman sticks 2 batteries down the handle. They make a funny noise as they slide down the handle. Like I said, the sound effects of this movie are great. And then the salesman pulls out the end cap that he's going to stick onto the end of the handle. Well, the end cap has a super long spring on the end because, of course, the spring has to reach all the way down the tube to contact the batteries, right? So that's a pretty elaborate joke, both with this sort of absurdist concept of the electric broom, but also a really great sight gag of the super long spring. Some of the jokes are somewhat standard slapstick fare. Some are not, right? There's a booth in this exposition hall with the vacuum where they advertise silent doors, right? And as soon as you see this, you kind of get the feeling that the silent door is going to be the payoff of a bit somehow, right? Like I said, there's another layer of expectation here. You kind of have a feeling something's going to happen. And a few minutes later, there's an argument where someone slams a door and it makes no sound, right? And you kind of expect this, but it's still the perfect payoff. I think it really shows that Tati performed as a mime long before he made films because he really knows how to land all kinds of interesting jokes. And he seems to have a stronger grasp of comedic logic than anyone else I can think of. That doesn't mean that this is the funniest movie ever made, but it is superlative in many, many ways. There's also a number of moments where Tati sets up a joke, but sidesteps it. For instance, at one point, Ulo looks like he's about to pull a Van Dyke and trip over a chair, one of the infamous chairs. But he turns around at the last second and he sees the chair and avoids it, which I guess you could also call pulling a Van Dyke. Again, it's a highly interactive moment. It relies on what you think is going to happen. Even when the joke doesn't happen, the joke has already happened. I don't think we need to get too deep here. Tati just has a real sensibility. He has a real grasp of dramatic logic, and he has a style, right? A real sensibility. It's not quite that certain jokes would be like too easy for him, but not every joke would be at home in a Tati movie. He has a style, right? He has a certain touch, and he understands somehow that Tulo not falling is sometimes funnier than if he did, or sometimes more fitting for this film and for that moment. Some of the jokes in Playtime are simple, like I said, but some of them are a long way from any kind of logic that I can really explain to you. For instance, Ulo keeps encountering the same chairs throughout the film. They have an odd behavior that I won't try to describe, but they make a funny sound when he sits on them. Again, it doesn't sound like much when I say it that way, but watch the movie. He keeps encountering these chairs. Eventually, he stumbles into an exhibition hall, the one where they have the vacuum and such. And, well, what do you think is the first thing on sale in this exhibition hall right inside the door? It's those chairs, right? Now, when I explain that, it hardly sounds like a joke, but it lands perfectly in this movie. My favorite joke in Playtime involves a model airplane in a restaurant. At one point, the restaurant gets really hot, and the airplane starts to melt. Again, this really doesn't make any sense, but it lands perfectly. Well, not the airplane, but the joke. I could go on and on and on here. There are so many bits in this movie, and these are really some of the simpler ones. The more elaborate setups are basically impossible to explain, partly because they're so elaborate and they involve so many different moving parts, so many different components, but also because, like I said, they're just such a long way from logic. It feels strange to even talk about them. This movie is an absurd show of force. It's kind of mind-boggling that one person could come up with all this stuff. It really is a work of genius in a field of one, essentially, which is truly remarkable. I've seen Playtime twice, and the second time I watched it, I was worried that I would see the punchline coming, that I'd be bored, wouldn't be surprised, things like that. But I actually ended up liking it even more the second time. I saw tons of new stuff, and I think the movie also just delivers on its identity so purely. It is so Tati-esque. In some circles, there is maybe an elitism around how many jokes you can see in the movie. That's pretty lame, but rest assured that there is a lot to look at. This almost reminds me of like an I Spy book in some ways, where there's always more things to see. And that I Spy book might actually be an interesting way to think about how the film is interacting with the modern world as well. Anyway, I could go on and on, but I want to switch gears a little bit. Playtime is a magnet for academics, which is somewhat ironic because I think the movie really needs no explanation. Why have I spent all this time explaining it? Well, I don't know. Honestly, just go watch the movie. Its virtues will be obvious. Everything I've talked about, everything that the big authors write about, you'll get it. Maybe you won't have the exact words for it, but you'll get it. That said, I understand why this is such a compelling movie to think about, such an inspiring movie to write about. And there is a lot written about Playtime. There's a famous essay by Kristen Thompson about it. There's a book, an entire book by Malcolm Turvey about it, all kinds of stuff. I don't buy everything that I've read about Playtime. For instance, Kristen Thompson briefly argues that the movie should be called Playtime. That's 2 words, play, space, time. In fact, I'll just quote for you a footnote in the essay where she explains this. She says, the title is, in fact, 2 words, not playtime, as it has usually been written. The difference is not negligible, since the separation puts more emphasis on the implications of the 2 words, especially time, while retaining the meaning of the single term. In fact, the title is 1 word, end quote, by the way. But this is not accurate. I mean, the title is 1 word, and in fact, who cares? To me, this reads almost as satire of academic writing, but I actually do like this essay. It opens up with a description of parametric film, which is a concept of neo-formalism. Don't feel bad if you haven't heard of those terms because no real people have ever used them. I'm honestly a little on the fence about the value of this type of framework. A cynic would say that leaning towards a unified theory of film is a big pseudo-empirical overreach that misses some organic reality of the media, possibly with an ulterior motive of writing more books. Academia, the self-fulfilling prophecy, cynic would say. But look, that's the intellectual low ground. And on the other hand, I think it's true that if you actually learn about these theories, they tend to be interesting and they tend to be enlightening, even after they are long forgotten, and even if they're long forgotten basically the moment that they're published. This essay is called Comedy on the Edge of Perception. It latches onto the density of the film, the difficulty of taking it in, and how that might be a story of modernism, comedy on the edge of perception, the edge of perception. I think there's something to this. I mentioned already how we see characters mirroring the experience of the audience throughout the movie. We constantly see characters struggling to see. It's an irony of technology that we are still struck by today. Shouldn't the intercom and the elevators make it easier than ever for Hulot to make his appointment? Well, they seem to have the opposite effect, right? There's a scene where Hulot seems to see his correspondent, the guy he's trying to meet up. He seems to see him in an adjacent building, and he walks outside to go catch him. But it turns out that, in fact, it's the reflection of the man in the building that he's just left, right? There's another scene where Hulot visits an apartment with a huge glass window looking onto the street. Big glass windows, big theme of this movie. Okay, you can maybe draw some parallels to the film screen, the proscenium effect, something like that. Anyway, big glass window looking onto the street. There's no privacy for occupants here, but nobody seems to notice that. The people in the apartment aren't bashful. The people on the street don't have prying eyes. Interesting. The characters in the film are constantly sort of bamboozled by modernity, constantly struggling to see. Playtime, like a lot of movies that academics like, is kind of about seeing. I don't think that Tati necessarily set out to make a movie about seeing, but the way that some of his jokes work pulls at the verges of what we can notice. Thompson points out that in some scenes, Tati uses cardboard cutouts in the background, but in other scenes, he swaps out the cutouts for actors, or at least some of the cutouts for actors standing perfectly still. The movie is basically full of Easter eggs, hidden or misdirected moments that cater to a certain type of viewership. Are these anything more than just another type of joke, another type of playfulness? Well, they mirror some of the struggles that the characters face traversing the city, and they imply a certain type of modern viewership. So, maybe. Despite being fairly biting, Playtime is not macabre. In some ways, the absurdity of this modern world is disarming. Thompson and others make slightly big claims about how the movie might teach one to cope with the modern world, how it might be a training program for living in New York City, for instance. I'm not sure I buy this, but there is a fascinating ambivalence to some of Tati's work. In Playtime, we only see city life, but some of Tati's earlier films set up a binary between the city and the country. This probably has a lot to do with France's rapid post-war industrialization. Well, your first instinct in these cases is to say that the film is saying that the country is good, tradition is good, and the city is bad. But is that really the message? There are some moments in Playtime, there's a couple moments where you catch a glimpse of the Eiffel Tower in the background, and it's a hint of something real, of this real city, this real place. And it seems to pretty strongly suggest that all this other stuff is not the stuff to see. On the other hand, the characters aren't really facing any great calamity, inconvenience at worst, maybe. Perhaps we should make something of the film's levity and accept the absurdity of modernism for better and for worse. Use this film to some extent as a hint that maybe there's something funny about this world we're living in. I'm not sure. Ultimately, when it comes to his message about modernism, I think Tati's touch is just as light as it is with his jokes. And the message that you might take away from this movie is actually surprisingly beguiling. Anyway, that's Playtime. It's a legendary movie, unparalleled. Man, I really like this movie. If you haven't seen it somehow, go check it out. Maybe read the essay, see what you